Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into the life of a woman who ruled for over 6 decades. A figure so iconic, her name defines an entire era, Queen Victoria. But we're not going to talk about her glorious reign or her role as a symbol of the British Empire. Instead, we're going to look at the other side of the coin, at the terrible, sometimes baffling, and often profoundly awful decisions she made. These are the choices that shaped her personal life, her family, and even the course of history. But not always for the better. You'll find that behind the stern, black-clad facade was a woman with a fiery temper, a stubborn streak, and a knack for making things incredibly difficult for herself and everyone around her. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a room at Kensington Palace. A young woman named Alexandrina Victoria looking out the window. A quiet, almost timid figure. She's 18 years old. And in a few short months, she'll be queen. But before the crown, before the power, there was a love story, or rather, a series of very public, very dramatic, and very awful decisions about love. You see, Victoria's early life was dominated by a period of extreme isolation and control. Known as the Kensington system, her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her comptroller, Sir John Conroy, kept her almost completely cut off from the outside world. A calculated move to ensure that Victoria would be totally dependent on them when she became queen. The idea was to keep her weak and compliant, and it was a miserable existence for the young princess the moment she became queen. Victoria, with a fiery streak no one had anticipated, threw off the shackles of the Kensington system. She banned Conroy from her presence and moved her mother to a separate wing of the palace. It was a bold and necessary move, but it was also the first of many awful decisions she would make with her heart. She was lonely, a young girl thrust into the most powerful position in the world, and she was desperate for a companion, a confidant. She found this in her first love interest, a man who, in retrospect, was a disaster waiting to happen. His name was Lord Melbourne. He was the Prime Minister, a man old enough to be her grandfather, and he became her constant companion and mentor. You can imagine the scene, a young, impressionable queen, hanging on the every word of a charming, worldly older man. They would spend hours together talking politics, art, and life. The problem? Their relationship was wildly inappropriate, a common historical fact that is often glossed over. The Prime Minister should have been a political advisor, not a surrogate father and a confidant. The entire court, and indeed the country, saw it as a terrible breach of decorum and a dangerous blurring of the lines between personal feelings and state business. Victoria, in her youthful naivety and stubbornness, refused to see the problem. Her affection for Lord Melbourne was so profound that she refused to listen to anyone who suggested he was an improper influence. This led to a series of political blunders, a truly awful decision that almost cost her the throne just a year into her reign. It's a lesser-known but fascinating detail of her early life. The Whig government, led by Melbourne, was losing popular support, and he was forced to resign. Victoria, heartbroken at the thought of losing her friend, refused to let the Tory leader, Sir Robert Peel, form a new government. She demanded that he keep her ladies of the bedchamber, who were all Whigs and her close friends. Peel, seeing this as an attempt to undermine his authority, refused. This became known as the bedchamber crisis, and it was a constitutional disaster. The entire country watched in shock as their young queen, barely out of her teens, put her personal feelings before the good of the country. The crisis was a clear example of Victoria's stubbornness and her complete inability to separate her personal life from her political duties. She was acting like a petulant child, and the reputation of the monarchy took a serious hit. The crisis was eventually resolved, with Melbourne returning to power for a time, but the damage was done. Victoria had shown herself to be politically naive and dangerously emotional, and the country was left wondering if she was truly fit to rule. It was a terrible decision, a blunder born of a profound loneliness and an almost complete lack of guidance. A fun, though slightly off-color, joke from the period was that the only thing the Queen and her Prime Minister had in common was that they both loved to talk about themselves. It was a moment of levity in a very serious crisis, but it also highlighted the perceived immaturity of the young Queen. The bedchamber crisis is a perfect example of Victoria's early reign, a period marked by a series of awful decisions based on personal emotions rather than political wisdom. She was a young woman, a sovereign, and a child all at once, and it was a dangerous combination. Her attachment to Lord Melbourne was not just a personal matter, it was a political liability, and she simply refused to see it. This stubbornness, this refusal to see her own mistakes, would become a hallmark of her reign and would lead to a number of other awful decisions down the line. You see, for all her power, Victoria was still a product of her upbringing. She was taught to be dependent, to rely on others for guidance, and when she found a man she trusted, she clung to him with a desperation that was both understandable and politically dangerous. Her relationship with Lord Melbourne was a crutch, a way for her to feel safe and secure in a world that was suddenly too big and too demanding. But it was a crutch that was also dragging her down, a terrible decision that almost destroyed her reign before it had even begun. The entire episode is a stark reminder that even the most powerful people are still just people, with all the flaws and emotions that come with it. It's a powerful and often overlooked detail that Victoria's early mistakes were not just political blunders, they were also a desperate cry for help from a lonely young woman. The echoes of the bedchamber crisis have faded, but the memory of your political misstep still hangs in the air. You, a young queen, have learned a hard lesson. Your heart and your politics cannot exist in a vacuum. You are now aware that your decisions have consequences. Not just for you, but for the entire nation. But you are also still lonely, still in need of a confidant, a partner, a love that is more than just a political alliance. And you find that love in your first cousin. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, he's a handsome, intelligent, and serious young man. And he quickly captures your heart. You fall in love, and you propose to him. A very un-Victorian but historically true detail. He accepts, and he comes to England, a foreigner in a land that is deeply suspicious of foreigners. And this is where a new chapter of awful decisions begins. A chapter guided not by your own youthful naivety, but by the quiet, pervasive influence of a man who was, in many ways, more ambitious and more politically astute than you. The first awful decision, one that would cause a cascade of problems for decades, was to give Albert no official title, no formal role in the government. This was a classic catch-22 situation. Parliament was wary of giving a German prince too much power. And Albert, for his part, was deeply offended by this. He was a prince consort in name only, a husband to the Queen, but with no real power or standing. This was a terrible decision, because it created a man who was a powerful force behind the scenes but had no public role. He was forced to work in the shadows, to influence you, his queen, from a position of profound powerlessness. You see, Albert was a man of immense intellect and passion. He was an innovator, a reformer, a visionary, but he had no outlet for these passions. He was a man who wanted to change the world, but he was trapped in a gilded cage. So, he channeled his energy into you. He became your closest confidant, your most trusted advisor, and your political partner. This was a dangerous dynamic, one that led to a number of very bad decisions on your part. You would take his advice on every matter of state, often to the detriment of your own authority and the well-being of the nation. One of the most profound and awful decisions made under Albert's guidance was his role in the Great Exhibition of 1851. This was a massive international exhibition of art, industry, and technology, and it was Albert's pet project. It was a massive undertaking, a huge gamble, and it was a logistical nightmare. The entire country watched with a mix of awe and skepticism as the Crystal Palace, a massive glass and iron structure, was built in Hyde Park. It was an incredible architectural feat, a marvel of the age, but it was also a political hot potato. The British public, and indeed a significant portion of the aristocracy, was deeply suspicious of the exhibition. They saw it as a dangerous and un-British display of foreign influence, a brazen and expensive show of wealth that was out of touch with the struggles of the common people. Albert, with your full support, pushed ahead with the project, ignoring the public's concerns and the political opposition. The exhibition was a smashing success, a global phenomenon that brought millions of people to London and cemented Britain's status as a global superpower. But it was also a decision that deepened the public suspicion of Albert and the monarchy, a feeling that would linger for decades. This is a fun, though slightly ironic, historical detail. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was so successful that it made a huge profit. The money was used to fund the creation of several museums and colleges, including the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Royal College of Music, two institutions that we still have today. So, a terrible decision, born of a foreign prince's ambition and a queen's stubbornness, ended up having a profound and lasting positive impact on British culture. It's a perfect example of how an awful decision can sometimes lead to a good outcome, almost by accident. But not all of Albert's influence was so benign. He was a powerful force in the military, and a terrible decision was made under his guidance to modernize the British Army. He was a great fan of military discipline and order, and he saw the British Army as a disorganized and inefficient mess. He pushed for a number of reforms, many of which were good in theory, but they were implemented with a ruthless efficiency that alienated the old guard of the military and the aristocracy. The army, a bastion of British tradition, was being changed by a German prince, and the resentment was palpable. This is a lesser-known but fascinating detail that highlights the deep-seated xenophobia of the time. And finally, you have to talk about the influence of Albert on your own personal life. He was a man who, for all his progressive ideas, was also deeply conservative and controlling. He wanted to mold you into the perfect queen, a symbol of domesticity and maternal virtue. He micromanaged every aspect of your life, from the way you dressed to the people you saw. This was a terrible decision on your part, to cede so much control to a man who, for all his good intentions, was stifling your own independent spirit. You became a vessel for his ideas, a puppet for his ambition, and you lost a part of yourself in the process. This is a point of academic debate. Was Albert a good or bad influence on Victoria? Some historians argue that he saved her from herself, that he gave her the structure and discipline she needed to be a great queen. Others argue that he suffocated her, that he turned her into a conservative, joyless figure who was a pale shadow of the fiery, passionate girl she once was. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. But one thing is for certain: their partnership led to a number of terrible decisions, both personal and political, that shaped the course of their reign and the destiny of the British Empire. The shadow of Prince Albert's influence stretches long. And you, as queen, find yourself not only navigating the treacherous waters of politics, but also the tempestuous currents of your own family. The terrible decisions you've made in your personal life have not stopped. They have simply changed form. As a wife, you were submissive and devoted to Albert, but as a mother, you became something else entirely: a stern, unforgiving, and often cold figure who inflicted emotional damage on her children. This is the story of your awful decisions as a mother. A story of a parent who loved her children but also controlled and criticized them to a degree that was both cruel and profoundly damaging. Your first terrible decision as a mother was to view childbirth and infants with a mixture of fear and disgust. You found the process of giving birth repulsive and described newborns as ugly and frog-like. This is a well-documented historical fact, and it's a difficult one to reconcile with your image as a symbol of domesticity. Your aversion to babies meant that you were a distant, hands-off parent in the early stages of your children's lives. You delegated their care to nannies and governesses, and you would only see them for brief. Supervised visits. This created a profound emotional distance between you and your children, a distance that would never truly close. But your hands-off approach to infants changed dramatically as they grew older. You became an obsessive and controlling parent, a decision that was, in many ways, more damaging than your initial detachment. You and Albert had a very specific vision for your children's education and upbringing, a vision that was incredibly strict and demanding. The children were expected to be perfect, to be paragons of virtue and intellect. They were subjected to a rigorous schedule of lessons, lectures, and religious instruction. There was little time for play, for fun, or for simple childhood joy. You and Albert believed that this discipline was necessary to mold them into future rulers and consorts. But the truth is, it was a form of emotional cruelty. A truly awful decision you made was the way you treated your eldest son and heir, Albert Edward, or Bertie, from an early age. You and Albert saw him as a disappointment. He was boisterous, undisciplined, and not particularly interested in his studies. You and Albert, in your frustration, began to criticize him relentlessly. You would write him long, scathing letters, pointing out his every flaw and failure. A fascinating and lesser-known detail is that these letters were often copied and sent to other family members. A public shaming that was both cruel and deeply humiliating for a young boy. This emotional abuse had a profound and lasting impact on Bertie. He grew up feeling like a failure, a disappointment, and he began to rebel against the strictures of his upbringing, a rebellion that would have serious consequences down the line. The way you treated your daughters was equally problematic. You were possessive and controlling, particularly of your eldest daughter, Victoria, or Vicky. You micromanaged her life, from her education to her courtship. A terrible decision you made was to arrange a marriage for her with the future German emperor, a match that was meant to create a powerful alliance between Britain and Prussia. Vicky, in her early teens, was sent to a foreign country, separated from her family, and thrust into a world that was deeply hostile to her English ways. You, as her mother, continued to write her long, critical letters, offering unsolicited advice and harsh judgments. Vicky, in her own way, was a victim of your ambition and your need for control, a tragic figure caught between two powerful nations. This brings up a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did Queen Victoria's children always look so sad? Because their mother kept telling them they were a disappointment. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the emotional climate of the royal family. Your maternal instincts, or lack thereof, are a point of academic debate. Some historians argue that your behavior was a product of the Victorian era, a time when strict discipline and emotional reserve were seen as virtues. They argue that you were simply doing what you thought was best for your children, that you were trying to prepare them for the immense responsibilities they would face. Others argue that your behavior was a result of your own unhappy childhood, a cycle of emotional abuse that you were doomed to repeat. The truth is, your decisions as a mother were a complex mix of both. You were a product of your time, but you were also a deeply flawed and often cruel parent, and your choices had a profound and lasting impact on your children, an impact that would ripple through generations, you can't help but feel a sense of sadness as you look at your family. A collection of beautiful, talented, but also deeply troubled individuals. They were all, in their own way, victims of your love, a love that was possessive, demanding, and often toxic. You, as queen, were a mother to a nation, but you were also a mother who failed her own children. And it's one of the most tragic and awful decisions you ever made. The emotional scars you've left on your children are a quiet tragedy, a personal disaster that unfolded behind the closed doors of the palace. But now, you are about to face a public catastrophe, a national shame that will forever stain your reign and your reputation. This is the story of the Great Famine of Ireland, a period of unimaginable suffering and death that was, in many ways, made worse by your own inaction and your government's terrible decisions. You see, for centuries, the Irish people had been oppressed by British rule. They were a people living in poverty, their land often owned by absentee British landlords. They were a nation of farmers, and their primary source of food was the humble potato. In 1845, a blight, a fungus known as Phytophthora infestans, swept through Ireland and destroyed the potato crop. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The food source for millions of people was gone, and the country was plunged into a state of famine. Your first awful decision, and a profoundly terrible one, was to believe that the famine was not as severe as it was. Your government, led by Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, initially responded with some aid, but it was far too little and far too late. The prevailing economic ideology of the time, laissez-faire capitalism, dictated that the government should not interfere with the market. They believed that the market would correct itself, that food prices would eventually fall, and that the private sector would provide the necessary relief. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The market did not correct itself. Food prices skyrocketed, and the people, without any money to buy food, began to starve. You, as queen, were a distant figure. You were safe in your palaces, surrounded by luxury and abundance. You and many in your court saw the Irish people as lazy and undeserving of help. This is a cruel but historically accurate detail. The Victorian English saw the Irish as an inferior race, a people who were responsible for their own misfortune. This racist and dehumanizing view of the Irish people led to a series of truly awful decisions. Your government refused to stop the export of grain from Ireland to England, a decision that is still a point of bitter contention, while the Irish people were starving. Shiploads of grain, cattle, and other foodstuffs were being sent to England to feed your wealthy subjects. The Irish people, in their desperation, could only watch as their food was taken from them. A particularly terrible decision, one that cemented your reputation in Ireland as the famine queen, was your personal donation in the early stages of the famine. You made a personal donation of $2,000 to the relief efforts. This seems like a generous amount, but when you consider the fact that, at the same time, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, a man who was not even a Christian, donated $1,000, you begin to see the inadequacy of your gesture. To the Irish people, this was a slap in the face, a paltry sum from a woman who was living in unimaginable wealth while her subjects were dying in the streets. This is a fascinating detail, and it's a grim reminder that a simple gesture can be a profound insult. The suffering of the Irish people was immense. They died from starvation, but they also died from diseases like cholera and typhus, diseases that were rampant in the overcrowded workhouses and slums. The population of Ireland was decimated. Over 1 million people died, and another million emigrated, many of them on what became known as the coffin ships, overcrowded and unsanitary vessels where a person was more likely to die from disease than to reach their destination. It was a national trauma, a wound that would never truly heal. Your government's response was a series of terrible decisions, born of a mixture of economic dogma, political indifference, and outright racism. They believed that the famine was God's will, a way to punish the Irish for their sins. They believed that the famine was a way to cleanse the Irish population, to get rid of the lazy and the unfit. This is a truly horrifying detail, a grim reminder of the cruelty and bigotry of the Victorian era. The academic debate still rages as to whether the Great Famine was a deliberate act of genocide or simply a series of tragic blunders. But one thing is for certain: your government's decisions, and your own inaction, made a terrible situation unimaginably worse. You, as queen, are a symbol of your nation, and your nation's actions in Ireland were a source of profound shame. The famine was a stain on your reign, a terrible decision that you and your government made with a mixture of arrogance and ignorance. It's a powerful and often overlooked detail that the image of Queen Victoria as a benevolent mother to her people was, for a significant portion of her subjects, a bitter and cruel joke. The ghost of the Irish famine looms large, a testament to the terrible decisions born of indifference and flawed ideology. But as you turn your gaze from the suffering at home, you, as queen, set your sights on a grander, more ambitious project: the expansion of the British Empire. This is a story of awful decisions made on a global scale, a ruthless and often brutal quest for power that would leave a trail of blood and suffering across continents. You see, for you and many of your subjects, the empire was not just a political entity, it was a moral crusade. You believed that it was Britain's duty to civilize the savage peoples of the world, to bring them the light of Christianity and the benefits of British rule. This was a profoundly arrogant and self-serving belief, a terrible decision born of a deep-seated sense of superiority. This is a common historical fact, and it's a difficult one to grapple with. The Victorian era, for all its advancements, was also a time of profound racism and bigotry, and you, as queen, were a product of that time. Your most egregious and awful decisions were made in India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. You, as queen, never visited India, but you ruled it with an iron fist. In 1857, a massive rebellion, known as the Indian Mutiny, broke out against British rule. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, and in the aftermath, you and your government made a series of terrible decisions. You, with the advice of your government, decided to formally take control of India from the East India Company, a decision that would lead to decades of direct British rule and an increase in the oppression of the Indian people. The most horrific and often overlooked detail of this period was the way the British treated the rebels. The punishment was swift, brutal, and often public. Rebels were tied to the mouths of cannons and blown to pieces, a particularly gruesome form of execution that was meant to strike fear into the hearts of the populace. This is a fascinating and terrifying fact, and it's a grim reminder of the cruelty of the British Empire. The academic debate still rages as to whether this was a necessary act of a punitive government or an act of sheer barbarism. But for the Indian people, it was a terrifying display of a foreign power's complete and utter disregard for their lives. Your imperial ambitions were not just confined to India. You, as queen, made a number of awful decisions in Africa, a continent that was carved up by European powers in a ruthless and cynical game of political chess. The scramble for Africa, as it was known, was a period of intense competition between European nations to colonize the continent. You and your government were at the forefront of this scramble, and the decisions you made led to a series of wars and conflicts that left millions of people dead and entire cultures destroyed. This is a brutal and unflinching detail that is often glossed over in the romanticized history of the British Empire. The British Empire was not built on a foundation of benevolence. It was built on a foundation of conquest and exploitation. Your terrible decisions in Africa are perhaps best exemplified by the Second Boer War in South Africa. The war was a conflict between the British Empire and the descendants of Dutch settlers, and it was a long, bloody, and ultimately pointless war, your government, in a terrible decision, decided to use scorched earth tactics, burning farms and villages, and to intern the Boer women and children in concentration camps. The conditions in these camps were horrific, and tens of thousands of people died from disease and starvation. This is a truly shocking detail, and it's a stain on the reputation of the British Empire. The Boer War was a war of aggression and conquest, and the decisions you, as queen, made in its pursuit were profoundly awful. You, as queen, were a powerful symbol of the empire, but you were also a powerful force for a series of awful decisions that led to immense suffering and death. You saw the empire as a source of national pride and glory, but you, and your government, were blind to the human cost of that glory. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did Queen Victoria want to expand the empire so much? Because she had so much mourning black. She wanted to make sure there were new places to wear it. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of the empire as a source of endless tragedy. The legacy of your terrible decisions is still with us today. The borders you drew, the cultures you destroyed, and the people you oppressed are still grappling with the consequences of your ambition. You, as queen, were a symbol of an era of immense change and power, but you were also a symbol of an era of immense cruelty and injustice, and for a significant portion of the world's population. Your name is not a symbol of glory, but a symbol of a time of profound suffering, a grim reminder of the awful decisions you made in the name of the British Empire. The vast and bloody canvas of the British Empire now has a new artist, the hand of a grieving widow. The glorious ambition and ruthless expansion have suddenly gone silent, replaced by the deep, suffocating sadness of a heartbroken. On December 14th, 1861, your beloved husband, Prince Albert, dies of typhoid fever. The light in your life is extinguished, and with it, your public duties. This is the story of your prolonged and profound mourning, and the truly awful decisions you made to withdraw from public life, plunging the country into a constitutional crisis and earning you the cruel nickname, the Widow of Windsor. Your first terrible decision was to completely abandon your public duties. The moment Albert died, you retreated from the world, from your family, and from your people. You moved to a series of private estates, most famously Osborne House and Balmoral Castle, and you refused to appear in public. The royal court, a bustling hub of life and politics, became a somber and silent place. The royal family, a symbol of national unity, was now a collection of ghosts, living in a perpetual state of mourning. This was a profoundly selfish and misguided decision. The country needed a queen, a symbol of stability and continuity. And you, in your grief, had abandoned them. Your withdrawal was so complete that you refused to even open Parliament. You, as queen, were a vital part of the political machinery of the nation, and your refusal to perform your duties plunged the country into a constitutional crisis. The government, a mix of old Whigs and new Liberals, was struggling to govern without the Queen's presence. There was a genuine fear that the monarchy itself was becoming irrelevant, a quaint and anachronistic institution that no longer served a purpose. The press, which had once adored you, began to turn on you. Cartoons and editorials appeared, showing you as a ghost in the palace, a mournful figure who had abandoned her people for her grief. A particularly fascinating and often overlooked detail is your bizarre relationship with your Scottish servant, John Brown. He was a simple gillie, a rugged, no-nonsense man who had been a favorite of Albert's. After Albert's death, you, in your grief, clung to Brown. He became your confidant, your companion, and your personal servant. He was granted a level of access to you that no one else had, a privilege that caused a great deal of scandal and speculation in the court. The newspapers, with a delicious combination of horror and amusement, began to speculate that Brown was more than just a servant, that he was your lover, and they gave you the cruel nickname, Mrs. Brown. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did Queen Victoria love John Brown so much? Because he was the only man who could tell her she was wrong. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the perceived absurdity of your relationship. Your relationship with Brown was an awful decision. Not because it was immoral, but because it was so flagrantly in defiance of royal protocol and public opinion. The British public, which had long been enamored with the idea of a virtuous and domestic queen, was now being asked to accept a queen who was a recluse and who had a suspiciously close relationship with a common servant. This decision, born of a profound grief and a desperate need for a connection, was a public relations disaster, and it did immeasurable damage to the reputation of the monarchy. The academic debate still rages as to the true nature of your relationship with John Brown. Some historians argue that he was simply a trusted friend, a man who gave you the simple, honest companionship that you had lost with Albert. Others argue that he was indeed your lover, and that the evidence, while circumstantial, points to a secret relationship. The truth is, we will probably never know for sure, but one thing is certain: your decision to keep him by your side, in defiance of all public opinion, was a terrible one. A decision that made you a figure of both pity and ridicule. You are now a figure of immense power and immense sadness. A woman who has given up her duty for her grief. You are the widow of Windsor, a symbol of a monarchy in decline, a testament to the terrible decisions a person can make when they are consumed by a profound and overwhelming sadness. The country, which had once loved you, now views you with a mixture of pity and resentment, and the future of the monarchy, once so secure, is now in question. You have been a grieving widow for many years, a reclusive figure shrouded in black, a monarch who has retreated from her public duties. But while you may have abandoned your people, you have not abandoned your family. In fact, you have become even more controlling, more manipulative, and more meddlesome. This is the story of your later years, and your terrible decisions in playing matchmaker for your children and grandchildren, creating a vast, interconnected, and profoundly dysfunctional network of royal marriages that would have devastating consequences for the future of Europe. Your first terrible decision was to use your children as pawns in a grand political game. You had 9 children, and you, along with your late husband Albert's grand vision, saw them not as individuals, but as diplomatic tools. Your goal was to marry them into the royal families of Europe, to create a vast web of alliances that would ensure peace and stability. You saw this as a noble and worthy goal, but in reality, it was a selfish and manipulative one. You were using your children's lives, their happiness, and their futures to serve your own political ambitions. The most famous and most tragic of these matches was the marriage of your eldest daughter, Victoria, to the future German emperor, Frederick III. This was a political marriage, pure and simple, and it was a terrible decision. Vicky, a brilliant and progressive young woman, was married to a man who, while good-hearted, was politically weak. She was sent to a country that was deeply conservative and militaristic, a country that was hostile to her English ways. You, as her mother, continued to meddle in her life, writing her long, critical letters, and offering a steady stream of unsolicited advice. Vicky, in her own way, was a prisoner in a foreign court, a victim of your ambition, and her life was a constant struggle. But the real tragedy of this match was the birth of your grandson, Wilhelm. He was a difficult child, born with a withered arm, and he had a profound sense of inadequacy. You, as his grandmother, were distant and critical, a decision that had a profound impact on his fragile psyche. Wilhelm grew up to be a bellicose and insecure man, and he would one day become the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, a figure who would play a central role in the outbreak of World War I. You, in your terrible decision to marry your daughter to a German prince, had, in a strange and tragic way, helped to create a man who would one day be a mortal enemy of your own country. And your terrible decisions in matchmaking didn't stop with your eldest daughter. You were obsessed with the idea of marrying your grandchildren into the royal families of Russia and Germany. Your granddaughter, Alex, was married to the future Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. This was a terrible decision. Alex was a shy, withdrawn woman who was profoundly unsuited for the life of a Russian empress. She was also a carrier of hemophilia, a genetic disease that she had inherited from you. A common and fascinating historical detail that is a result of your own genetics. She passed this disease on to her son, Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne. The boy's illness would lead Alex to rely on a mystic named Rasputin, a man who would play a central role in the downfall of the Russian monarchy. You, in your terrible decision to marry your granddaughter into the Russian court, had, in a strange and tragic way, helped to create the conditions for the Russian Revolution. This brings up a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why was Queen Victoria's family known as the grandmother of Europe? Because she had a hand in every single royal marriage, and every single one seemed to end in disaster. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of your matchmaking. The academic debate still rages as to the true impact of your matchmaking on the course of European history. Some historians argue that the relationships between the royal families of Europe were a source of stability, a way to prevent war. Others argue that they were a source of profound dysfunction, a network of squabbles, jealousies, and resentments that made the political climate of Europe even more volatile. The truth is, your decisions were a complex mix of both. You were trying to do what you thought was best for Europe, but in doing so, you were also profoundly damaging the lives of your own children and grandchildren. Your legacy, in this context, is not one of peace and stability, but one of a family that was a political tool, a collection of broken hearts and shattered dreams, the echoes of your matchmaking. Those terrible decisions that created a web of royal dysfunction now resonate across a different battlefield, the social and political landscape of your own nation. You have spent your life as queen, a symbol of power and authority. But now you are about to face a new and formidable enemy, the women of England, who are demanding the right to vote. This is the story of your deeply conservative and frankly awful decisions regarding women's rights, and your active opposition to the burgeoning women's suffrage movement. You see, for you, the idea of a woman having a political voice was not just a foreign concept, it was a profoundly dangerous one. You believed in the traditional roles of men and women, a common historical fact of the Victorian era. Men were meant to be the public figures, the politicians, the soldiers, the leaders. Women were meant to be the private figures, the wives, the mothers, the caretakers. You, as queen, saw yourself as the ultimate example of this domestic ideal, a mother to a nation, but a mother who did not have, and did not want, a political voice. This was a profoundly hypocritical and terrible decision, a decision born of a deep-seated belief in a social order that you, as a powerful female ruler, were a living contradiction of. Your most egregious and awful decisions were made in your opposition to the women's suffrage movement. The movement, led by a number of brilliant and passionate women, was gaining momentum, and they were beginning to demand a political voice. They were holding rallies, writing articles, and lobbying Parliament, and you, in your stubbornness and your profound conservatism, became their most powerful enemy. You as queen, wrote private letters to your Prime Minister, William Gladstone, expressing your profound disgust for the movement. A fascinating and little-known detail is that you would often use the phrase "mad, wicked folly" to describe the women's suffrage movement. This phrase, and your powerful opposition, were a significant roadblock to the movement. Your words, while private, were carried with the weight of the crown, and they were a clear signal to your government and the public that you would not support the cause. Your opposition to women's rights wasn't just limited to the vote. You were also opposed to women having access to higher education. You believed that a woman's brain was too delicate for the rigors of a university education. A truly awful and outdated belief. You believed that a woman's place was in the home, and that a university education would only make her unwomanly and unfit for her duties. This is a profoundly sexist and ridiculous belief, and it's a stain on your legacy. You, a woman who had a profound influence on the course of European history, were actively campaigning against other women having the opportunity to have an education. It's a cruel and ironic twist of fate, a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period was, why did Queen Victoria hate women's suffrage because she didn't want any competition for the throne? It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of your opposition. The academic debate still rages as to why you were so opposed to women's rights. Some historians argue that your opposition was a product of your time, a reflection of the prevailing social and political norms of the Victorian era. Others argue that your opposition was a form of self-preservation, a fear that if other women were given a political voice, your own unique position as a powerful female ruler would be undermined. The truth is, your decisions were a complex mix of both. You were a product of your time, but you were also a deeply flawed and often hypocritical individual, and your opposition to women's rights is one of the most awful decisions you ever made. You, as queen, are a powerful symbol of your nation, and your nation, in the form of its women, was asking for a voice, and you, in a series of terrible decisions, told them no. Your legacy, in this context, is not one of progress and enlightenment, but one of profound conservatism and a stubborn refusal to adapt to the changing times. The suffragettes, the brave women who fought for their rights, were fighting against a system that was deeply entrenched, and you, as queen, were the ultimate symbol of that system. Your name, for a significant portion of the population, is not a symbol of glory, but a symbol of oppression and a stubborn refusal to give women the rights they deserved. You've made a series of terrible decisions throughout your reign, from your personal life to your political influence. But perhaps none were as consistent and as damaging as your relationship with your own heir, your son, Albert Edward, or Bertie. This is the story of your unloved son, and the awful decisions you made to sideline him, to criticize him, and to mold him into a man who, in your eyes, would never be worthy of the throne. From an early age, you and your beloved Albert saw Bertie as a disappointment. He was not a serious scholar, not a disciplined soldier, not a pious prince. He was, in a word, a wastrel. He was interested in sports, in women, in parties, in all the things that you and Albert despised. This is a common historical fact, and it's a difficult one to grapple with. The future King of England was, in many ways, the black sheep of the family. Your first terrible decision was to try and control him with an iron fist. You and Albert subjected him to a rigorous and unforgiving education, a schedule of lessons and lectures that left him with little time for anything else. The idea was to mold him into a perfect prince, a man who would be worthy of the throne. But the truth is, the education was a failure. Bertie was not a serious scholar, and the more you and Albert pushed him, the more he rebelled. He would sneak out of the palace. He would have affairs, and he would engage in all the vices that you and Albert were so determined to keep him from. This is a fascinating and often overlooked detail the more you tried to control him. The more he resisted. A perfect example of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the most awful decision, and the one that would have the most profound consequences, was your decision to sideline him from all matters of state. When Albert died, you, in your grief, made the terrible decision to keep Bertie away from the government. You saw him as a fool, a womanizer, a man who could not be trusted with the affairs of the nation. You refused to share state secrets with him. You refused to let him see the red boxes of government documents. And you refused to give him any role in the running of the country. This was a profoundly foolish and dangerous decision. Bertie was the future king of England, and you were deliberately keeping him ignorant and unprepared for his future role. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did Queen Victoria hate her son so much? Because he was having all the fun she wasn't. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of your relationship. Your decision to sideline Bertie had a number of terrible consequences. He was a man with no purpose, no role, no real reason to exist. He was a prince in waiting, a man who was surrounded by power but had none of his own. He was forced to live a life of idleness and pleasure, a life that you, in your hypocrisy, so despised. This is a profound and tragic detail. You, in your attempt to make him a better man, had succeeded only in making him worse. He became a man who was defined by his vices, a man who was seen by the public and the court as a playboy and a fool. The academic debate still rages as to the true nature of Bertie's character. Some historians argue that he was indeed a wastrel, a man who was more interested in pleasure than in duty. Others argue that he was a man who was simply trying to find his own way in a world that was so dominated by his powerful mother. They argue that he was a man who, if given the chance, could have been a great king. The truth is, we will never know for sure because you, in your terrible decision to sideline him, never gave him the chance to prove himself. You, as queen, were a powerful symbol of your nation. But you were also a deeply flawed and often cruel mother. Your relationship with your son was a tragedy, a story of a mother who, in her grief and her conservatism, deliberately and systematically undermined her own child. Your legacy, in this context, is not one of a glorious reign, but one of a family that was deeply dysfunctional, a royal house that was defined by its internal struggles. The unloved heir, the man who would one day be king, was a victim of your awful decisions, a man who was never truly given the chance to be the person he could have been. The long and tumultuous reign of Queen Victoria is finally coming to a close. You have lived through decades of political turmoil, personal tragedy, and a series of profoundly awful decisions that have shaped the course of history. But even in death, your terrible decisions continue to echo. A final, strange, and bizarre set of choices that would cement your complicated legacy. This is the story of your final farewell, and the weird, almost morbid decisions you made for your own death and funeral. You are 81 years old, and you are nearing the end. You are surrounded by your family, a vast and complicated web of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a legacy of your matchmaking. You are at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, a place you loved, a place where you felt safe, and as you lie on your deathbed, you, in a final act of stubbornness and control, make a series of terrible and strange decisions for your own funeral. Your first terrible decision, a decision that would shock the nation, was to demand that your funeral be a military one. You, a woman who had spent your life as a symbol of domesticity and maternal virtue, wanted to be buried like a soldier. You demanded that your coffin be carried by a gun carriage, and that your funeral procession be a grand military affair, complete with soldiers and sailors. This was a profoundly strange and un-Victorian request, a final act of defiance against the image that had been created for you. The country, which had long been accustomed to a queen in black, was now being asked to mourn a queen in a military uniform. It's a fascinating and little-known detail, a final act of rebellion from a woman who had been, in many ways, a prisoner of her own image. But your strange decisions didn't stop there. In a final, terrible act of control, you demanded that your personal physician, a man named Sir James Reed, place certain objects in your coffin. These were not objects of great value or importance, but rather a collection of personal items that you had clung to in your grief. You demanded that he place a plaster cast of Albert's hand in your coffin, a personal memento of the man you had loved so dearly. You also demanded that he place a cloak of Albert's in the coffin, a final, physical reminder of the man you had mourned for so long. This is a truly bizarre and morbid detail. A final, desperate attempt to be reunited with the man who had been the center of your life. The act was a deeply personal one, but it was also a final, terrible decision. A public display of a grief that had consumed you for 40 years. This brings up a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did Queen Victoria want to be buried with a cloak? Because she knew it was going to be a long trip to the afterlife. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of your final requests. The academic debate still rages as to the true meaning of your final requests. Some historians argue that they were a final, desperate act of a woman consumed by grief, a final attempt to be with the man she had loved so dearly. Others argue that they were a final, defiant act of a woman who was tired of being a symbol, a final attempt to be a person, with all the flaws and emotions that came with it. The truth is, your final decisions were a complex mix of both. You were a grieving widow, but you were also a powerful monarch, and your final wishes were a reflection of both sides of your character. The funeral itself was a grand and somber affair, a final, powerful symbol of your long and complicated reign. The country, which had been so divided by your decisions, was united in grief. The procession, a military spectacle, moved through the streets of London, and the country watched as the longest reigning monarch in British history was laid to rest. But for those who knew the truth, the funeral was also a final, terrible reminder of a life filled with awful decisions, a life of profound grief, and a life of profound hypocrisy. You, as queen, were a powerful symbol of your nation, but you were also a deeply flawed and often cruel individual. Your legacy is not one of a glorious reign, but one of a reign that was defined by its internal struggles, its political blunders, and its profound tragedies. Your final farewell, with its strange mix of military pomp and morbid personal details, was a fitting end to a life that was so full of contradictions. And now, as you are laid to rest, the long, slow hum of the funeral procession fades, and the world is left to grapple with the terrible decisions of Queen Victoria. The world you leave behind is a complex and tumultuous one, a world that is still grappling with the consequences of your awful decisions. The empire, your grand project, is a source of immense pride but also immense shame. The royal family, your creation, is a beautiful and complicated web of alliances and resentments. The political landscape, a world you tried to control, is a world of change and revolution. Your name, Queen Victoria, will forever be a symbol of a time of immense power and immense suffering. A testament to the terrible decisions a person can make when they are a ruler, a wife, a mother, and a symbol. And now, your story. A story of a life so full of contradictions finally comes to an end. The final chapter closes, and the weight of history begins to lift. The grand palaces and the dark politics, The cruel choices and the quiet grief, all of it begins to soften, to recede into a gentle, historical blur. You are no longer standing in the shadow of a powerful queen, but in the quiet stillness of a moment after the story has ended. The sound of the wind outside, the gentle whir of a fan, the soft rhythm of your own breathing. Everything is slowing down. The complex web of Victoria's life is now a single, peaceful thread, and you can let go of it. The history is done, the journey is over. There's nothing left to do but close your eyes and rest.